all across America and around the world. This is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Good day. I'm Jim Fossone. I'm the officer of the deck today here on Veterans Radio, and thanks for joining us. We've got some interesting stories for you. We always want to remind you you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or at the web, veteransradio.org, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.org. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com. We just want to remind you that Veterans Radio podcasts are available on all your favorite streaming platforms, including RSS.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Rees Across America Radio. So wherever you are, you can find us, whether it's on your mobile phone or your computer or your laptop, your tablet. But listen in to Veterans Radio Podcasts. We post something new every week, and you're going to find it informative. We want to welcome to Veterans Radio today Dr. Brandon Weiss. He is a licensed clinical psychologist and professor at Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. That's the longest title I've read in a while. Brandon, welcome to Veterans Radio.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, Jim. Appreciate it.
I want to give a little background on why you have been toiling in the field you've been toiling on for a decade, and why now it's, hey, this is, I'm in the sweet spot. But Dr. Weiss, clinically trained at San Diego Veterans Affairs Healthcare System, University of California, San Diego, in cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure, and completed a National Institute of Health Fellowship. He has been working, as I said, for 10 years or more now, investigating whether and how psychedelics may improve mental health, especially for military veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress. How did you get into this 10 years ago?
Yeah. Well, 10 years ago, 10 years ago, I became aware of psychedelics around the time that I was doing my master's in psychology. And it was the summer before I was about to do my clinical psychology training. And I was just hearing, transformational stories about people after their psychedelic experiences. And during my training, I was learning to do psychotherapy, and it's something that was helpful for a lot of people, but not for everyone. And it was just clear that those psychotherapies that I was learning to do in a really precise manner, that those had sort of been around for already a couple decades, and our mental health treatments had been around for that amount of time. And I just had this sort of intuition that potentially psychedelics could be a new class of treatment that could be sort of an innovation and help a lot of the patients that I was seeing at the time who weren't responding as quickly or as well, to some of the psychotherapies.
Give an example of the traditional psychotherapies so that our listeners who may not be all that familiar can go, oh, I see how this is different.
Yeah. So one traditional psychotherapy for PTSD that I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with is called prolonged exposure therapy. And in this therapy, the therapist asks the patient to really go in, go back to the memory, the trauma memory, in vivid detail, not only in session, but also outside of session. And also think about all of the situations and activities they might be avoiding, because of a trauma response to those sorts of cues, like going underneath they're in combat, going underneath overpasses or being around out in a community with a lot of people, these sorts of things. And so in that therapy, there's sort of this structured way in which the therapist will help the person to go out into the world in a gradual way and get exposure to those situations to relearn that in their present environment, those situations can be more safe than they thought. Yeah.
Historically, particularly at the VA, everything sort of had a drug-related, you know, I'm going to prescribe this or that, and that ought to solve your problems. How has that changed over time as you've been in the field, and how does that evolve into something new like psychedelic drugs?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, my training was in clinical psychology, but I also worked as a clinical in my clinical training at the San Diego VA, and there I was working on like an interdisciplinary team with psychiatrists who. So my patients at the time, like they were on lots of drugs and they were doing psychotherapy with me. Um, I think that it's still really prominent that people are primarily treated with a drug that is regarded as being like kind of passive in its action. It doesn't need anything else. And oftentimes these drugs like antidepressants that are prescribed for PTSD also, like they're sort of dumbing down symptoms. But they're not inviting the person or kind of asking the person to really go into the roots of what the problem is necessarily. Um, and yeah, I think that's still extremely common. And then, of course, psychotherapy is much more intensive. Like people are going in, they're really working directly on the problems. But what the problem there is that it's so intensive and hard that a lot of people have difficulty, like putting themselves through that. And there's a really high degree of
Over and over, you have to do it over and over again, right? That's the
yeah.
prolonged exposure part of this is you know what is causing that. Maybe it was a combat situation, maybe it was MST, maybe it was something else gruesome in your life. But in psychotherapy, I got to keep talking about it. Let's start with men and veterans, probably in particular. We're not great talkers. We're not all that introspective, and you want us to do that for how long? As you were seeing this in practice through your clinical practice, again, how did that weave into? There's always been sort of anecdotal stories about this drug use or that drug use, illicit or not, and I had some sort of epiphany. But where did it pull into for you to being more of just an anecdotal story to, hey, we have to set something up from a scientific medicine standpoint?
Yeah. Well, for me, so while I was doing my therapy training, I was also doing research. And one of my research projects was to look into, I wasn't at a center that was actually able to administer psilocybin or these other drugs ourselves. So I was doing observational work and I was looking at actually ayahuasca ceremony down in South America that a lot of veterans were flocking to at the time because they were dissatisfied with what kind of solutions were offered here. And it's there that I had first person experience where I would go down and do field work and I would observe like how people were responding. And I actually brought a cohort of Special Operations Forces veterans down as part of a study. It wasn't me bringing them down, but I was doing the research part of it. And it just through that experience is just the changes that I saw were so compelling that this could act as fast as it did and really push people really deep into the roots of what was going on, and also at the same time provide a sense of hope. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that South American experience, because it's sort of a probably up here in the United States with sort of non-traditional medicine, maybe native medicine approach to things that certain Western medicine biases would have first went, "You're doing what?" So why don't you explain what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is, this isn't necessarily something that I like endorse doing. It's the research that I was doing early on because I was trying to just get a sense of how these compounds, these psychedelic compounds could affect people. And there are also, I want to say, like, it's not all a panacea, it's not, there are very challenging experiences. Um, there is like a risk of people doing worse after some of these therapies. So I just want to make that clear as I'm kind of talking about it. And I don't necessarily want to promote people, going down outside of the US and, to put themselves at risk necessarily. But what I'll say is that, this is an indigenous cultural practice that is hundreds of years old, and it brings in like a lot of really interesting spiritual and philosophical, mindsets about, like, for example, spirits. There's sort of within that tradition, there's an understanding that there are spirits all around us, these shamans, the ayahuasqueros, that are singing songs after people drink ayahuasca. They believe that they're communicating with these spirits, and they've dieted plants that they believe have spirits within them. And also, I think that you sit in this like oftentimes very beautiful setting that's all wooden, and people are hearing each other. It's a group format, so you're seeing what other people are going through, and you are ingesting like quite large amounts of this brew, the ayahuasca brew. And so I think that actually the potency of the dose that people are getting is larger than probably in the psilocybin clinical trials as well.
Yeah, and I was made a note while you were talking. You brought the word up. It's all about dosage, right? It's all about, and certainly in Western medicine in our culture, it's controlling the dosage, knowing what dosage is advantageous and which dosage may be harmful. So as you are doing research now at Johns Hopkins, tell us a little bit about how that's evolving to deal with, I guess, right, two issues, right? Does this stuff work?
Yeah.
What's the right dosage? And maybe that's efficacy, if I've got the word right. So talk to us a bit about, Johns Hopkins is a pretty prestigious place. Even Johns Hopkins is looking at this. So tell us about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Like, and it's a, conscientious question to ask about like the dosing and precision that we're applying. And it's interesting because, we used to do weight-based dosing. So you would get more, psilocybin if you had more weight. But we sort of learned that over like across lots of different centers that were doing this work, that actually people didn't respond, any more intensely who were heavier than others. And so, at a certain point, the field generally, they started to give a particular fixed dose, which is today 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin. And they actually used to, like, in the 2000s, there were trials, not clinical trials, but with healthy participants who were getting, like, I believe it was 30 milligrams per 70 kilograms. And they observed that actually for substantive number of people, there were more distressing experiences at that level. So they sort of brought it down. Now what's typically done, what's done at some centers and within our first PTSD trial, is we start with a certain dose. And then if people are not responding to it, and like they're not having that kind of psychoactive experience, then we would elevate the dose.
And that, again, typical medicine approach to these kind of problems that we all can go, yeah, that makes sense to us. I'm going to have you back up a little bit because I think a lot of folks probably aren't familiar with some of the terminology Explain what psilocybin is and where it's from. Now, you've mentioned you're using a synthetic, but there's tell us where it comes from naturally and how that got isolated as that's what we ought to try.
Yeah. So psilocybin, it's a component of different plants, mainly mushrooms. It's not only in one type of mushroom, it's in many types of mushroom. One of them, for example, is the Scolosopi cubensis. And It exists in these, mushrooms at different concentration levels. Actually, even within a certain species, like there's a lot of variability in how much psilocybin is in it. Um, and what psilocybin does is it enters the body, it's metabolized in the body, primarily in the liver, and it's turned into its metabolite called psilocin, and psilocin can bind to certain receptors in the brain, and in the cortex, which is a part of the brain, and it binds to a receptor that is the serotonin 2A receptor. And when it does that, there's just interesting physiology that occurs. So I'll one of those kind of interesting phenomena are that brain regions, brain networks that generally don't really communicate with one another seem to be communicating with one another.
Interesting, which is why you're doing this research, and hard for maybe the regular person to understand how this works. But let me back up a bit. So psilocybin is a naturally occurring compound.
It is. It is.
And somewhere along the line, humankind decided those mushrooms, the classic psychedelic mushrooms, it got isolated to what is it that's causing that different brain activity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there are indigenous populations that have been using these mushrooms for many, many years. And of course, I just want to clarify that when within our clinical trials, like when the FDA approves our clinical trials, we're actually using a synthetic version of that. But the actual structure of that molecule, originated in nature.
And we'd want synthetic control because we had quality control and everything else, rather than just, hey, we went out to the woods, grabbed some mushrooms, give these a try. So when you talk about clinical trials that are occurring, I guess now, from the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, are there veterans with PTS? Do you have when I think of a clinical trial, maybe there's 200 guys, 100 are getting something, 100 are getting placebo. Tell us what a clinical trial in this area looks like.
Yeah. So there have only been so many so far that have focused on PTS. There's been only one published trial that was recently last year published. It was only in 22 individuals with PTS. And within our trial, which we're just writing up now, it was another pilot study. So a small cohort of people. For us, it was 21 people uh, who they come into our study, they're screened medically and psychiatrically to make sure that they meet this kind of criteria that's in the study and that it's safe to undergo this treatment. They received in that trial psychological support and preparation for the psilocybin session. Following their first session, they also received like additional support sessions. And generally, what happens there is people will explore whatever kind of phenomena, insights, meaning came up for them during their experience. And that's really personal. And there's also exploration of what does this mean for me? What does it mean for my family and my life and how I spend my time and these sorts of things, my future. There in our study was a second session of psilocybin, and then 5 additional sessions where we had therapists and facilitators holding that space. Um, Ours was interesting too, because even though it was a small study, we did randomize people to different conditions. So after their first psilocybin session, they received either psychological support, which is very non-directive and kind of open to where people want to go, what's important to them to explore. And then another, which actually was included elements of cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure that I described before. And so right now we're comparing those two, but that's the general structure of it.
And we're talking to Dr. Brandon Weiss a little bit, not a little bit, a lot, because VA's just announced they're going to start doing some trials and they're going to start looking at this, and the federal government's kind of more, is it fair to say, more open to this kind of research than they've been in the past?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
And so, that's sort of anything that will help veterans, particularly those with bad PTS, kind of break through that wall, and it's something that maybe more common traditional drugs, psychotherapy hasn't helped them. If there's another tool in the toolbox, I think we all want it for them. Um, as these clinical trials progress, is this a 10-year effort before VA is going to be able to make this available to people, or is it no, this tool is going to get in the toolbox in the next year or two?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there are two companies that have phase three trials and have submitted, well, at least one that submitted an application to the FDA for approval of psilocybin. And that's under consideration right now by the FDA. And so that is a product, a synthetic psilocybin product that could be approved as early as later this year, but might take longer. It also could be rejected potentially, even though there does seem to be a lot of kind of political support around it. Um, and if that occurred, the limiter to it being prescribed and available to people would be how well places like the VA and other hospital systems are able to actually like create that infrastructure to be able to deliver it.
And particularly, you talked about your trials, but it's not just here's a pill, take it and go away. There's a lot of therapeutic support that has to be wrapped around that veteran when they're using psilocybin to get the most positive outcome. I think I hear. So being able to put it into the field at VA kind of requires not just having the pill available, but everything else, doesn't it?
Yeah, we just met with a representative from the VA who's actually focused on how do we integrate psychedelics into the VA system. And that is one of, his principal areas of focus is how do we train people to build that kind of support um, structure around the psilocybin itself. I think there is a consensus among lots of people that support is really important to create space for that support. It's not something we're still learning about this, like how essential it is for every single person, which might not be the case for every single person because a lot does happen within the session itself. But having that support in place, is really, really important.
So a couple of things before we run out of time. I think we could talk a lot longer because every time you say something, it goes, oh, I want to. So you said a session. So when I take my 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin, how long is the session that drug's having an impact on my brain, and I'm processing things in a way that hopefully are helpful?
Yeah. So generally the effects last 6 hours.
Wow.
But that varies from person to person, especially when it's ingested, because every person's body is different and their body's different in breaking down the drug or the effect the drug has on the brain. And so some people, the onset is later. Some, sometimes they don't have the big effect. So yeah.
Well, that almost makes it sound like it has to, if not be an inpatient process, at least a sort of 24-hour. I gotta wait till it kicks in, and I gotta be around for as long as it lasts, as in terms of the medical provider there. Very interesting. Another point I wanted to bring up, because from something you said, which is the politics of this. As you again have toiled in this field for 10 years, how do you view the politics of moving this option available into the general medical mainstream?
Well, I can only say that I really strongly support the same standards of rigor at the FDA in evaluating the safety and efficacy of these drug therapies as have been performed in the past. And but this has become like kind of a political football in a way, and so there does seem to be some pressure being applied to various places, but it's not yet clear that, those standards will be affected.
You can see why he has a PhD. He really got around my question. And I had told him earlier, I said, Brandon, if I ask you a question you don't want to answer, just say so. Good answer. Let me try it another way. Have you seen support from veteran organizations on trying to advance not only the research and the trials, but trying to advance the whole concept of getting this integrated psychedelics into the VA? Have you seen veteran organizational support?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a large number of veteran organizations they're committed. I would say that there's sort of an advocacy side. Like I know this works, and I just need to integrate it as soon as possible. And then there's sort of the focus on the research. We need to get the research right in order to inform people who are going to make the decisions. But it's both. And I think as things have gone further and further now, a big focus is, and it's happening also in brass at the VA, but you know, how do we actually perform this at the VA? Who do we need to train? What infrastructure needs to exist?
That was an answer that got him around the political. We'll let the veteran organizations advocate or work on the politics while his team and others work on the science and medicine of it. Good answer. Good answer. What other information do you think that the general public, the veteran public who are listening in, Dr. Weiss, on Veterans Radio, what didn't I ask you that they should know about? Go ahead and close this out.
Yeah. Well, um, I let's see what. Yeah.
We often hear like these very hopeful things that never come to pass.
Hmm.
So if I come back to you in 5 years, am I going to say, well, that never came to pass? Or do you think we're past the tipping point on that? The research is solid, the momentum's solid. So are you comfortable telling veterans and their friends and their family members today that somewhere in the near future, this may be a tool in the toolbox for PTS?
Yeah, I think that it's likely that in the future, not necessarily in the next couple years, we don't know exactly what'll happen, but there's so many different types of people, advocates, stakeholders, who are involved now in this that I would be surprised if at some point in the future it wasn't approved and available. But it's really going to, and that's also based on some of the safety data that I've seen from these phase 3 trials that were recently shared, but we don't know all the details about them. There is a possibility that the Compass Pathways application will be rejected on scientific grounds, that they can't establish, that that there are causal effects of the drug itself. But so far, the safety data seems to be, strong enough to support approval based on my, personal opinion. But, obviously, I'm not analyzing all of the data, so take it with a grain of salt. Um, but yeah, I think it's more likely than not that within the next 5 years, this treatment will likely be available to people.
Well, that gives everybody hope too, that there'll be some breakthroughs, there'll be some new tools in the toolbox to treat veterans with post-traumatic stress syndrome. Doctor, thanks for your time today on Veterans Radio. It's been in the news lately, and we wanted to bring it forward to our radio listeners, and this has been really informative. Thank you.
Great. Can I say one more thing too?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think a good mentality to have around this treatment, because it is more unpredictable in what its effects will be, especially for folks who have traumatic experiences that could also come up within their experience, within their drug experience, is just to go in not with this sort of sense of assurance that this is necessarily going to be the revolutionary cure. It's to be open to maybe this, doesn't work as well for me because it's a very individual thing. But to, entertain that possibility if someone's comfortable entering into this, that there could be more there as well.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced that there's no silver bullet in medicine to solve medical problems. All we have to do is look back at our vaccines with COVID-19 and said, well, that helped, but it wasn't a silver bullet for everybody, and actually worse for some. So, no, that's a good cautionary advice. Brandon, thanks again for your time today with Veterans Radio.
Absolutely. Oh, can I just mention it? We can stop recording if you want to, but I want to mention our study also, Jim.
Go ahead.
We're actively recruiting for a study. It's called the the PAMVET trial. And we're very open to people who may be interested in that. We're still, recruiting and enrolling people. So I can provide you with information.
What would be the link? Where would they go if they were interested in at least exploring if they're an appropriate candidate to participate in the clinical trial?
So the entry point to fill out the first kind of screener is at hopkinspsychedelic.org/PAMVET, PAMVET. And there you can learn about the study and fill out the e-screener, and if you're eligible, then we'll reach out to you about that.
Excellent. I'm glad to pass it along. Again, thanks for your time today, and I want to thank everybody for listening to Veterans Radio today. I am Jim Faussone. It's been a pleasure to be your host. I'm a veterans disability lawyer at Legal Help for Veterans, and you can reach us at 800-693-4800 or legalhelpforveterans.com on the web. You can follow Veterans Radio on Facebook and listen to its podcasts and internet radio shows by visiting us at veteransradio.org. That's veteransradio.org. We again want to thank our national sponsors, the National Veterans Business Development Council, nvbdc.org, Legal Help for Veterans, a veterans disability law firm with a national practice before the VA, can help you on your claims and your appeals. It can be reached at legalhelpforveterans.com or 1-800-693-4800. We also want to thank our local sponsors. This would include the Charles S. Kettles chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America, that's chapter 310, VFW Graf O'Hara Post 423, the American Legion Irwin Preskin Post 46 in Ann Arbor as well, the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System, and certainly the National Vietnam Veterans of America Association. You can be a sponsor by going to veteransradio.org, clicking on the About Us and our sponsors, and help us out. Keep this program alive for the 21 and 22 years. Keep us going for another 20. Thank you.